So we'll turn to the first one first. First, we need to clarify the meaning of university learning, and we need to clarify the meaning of learning. We need to understand what it means from a variety of different theoretical perspectives, because the same idea or word means different things to different people. We can look at this example. If I say to you transportation, that's a quite simple word, a quite simple concept perhaps, and some of you are going to think about planes, some of you are going to envision buses, others of you will think about cars, and some will think about bicycles, and who knows what else you might be thinking when I say transportation. So the same is true of the word learning. When I say we're going to learn something, you might have quite different pictures about what that means, what it will result in, and how to go about it. So your first reflection question is, very briefly, to think about what does it mean to learn something? How do you know, then, if you have learned something? So take just a minute and think about that. All right, good. Now let's take a look at some research that outlines a variety of different conceptions of learning that are commonly held and how those relate to what is expected in universities. From the literature on learning, we can describe two main conceptions of learning. The first is represented here by this pile of rocks on the left-hand side. This is a representation of learning as a quantitative increase in knowledge. So just like the stones in this pile of rocks, it sort of envisions learning as a pile of things, a pile of facts, or a pile of theories, accumulated one on top of another. A second major way of looking at learning is to view it as some kind of a change process, as a process of transformation or qualitative change. And the images here suggest that you could look at a tree in a variety of different ways, and that you'll have a changed perception of that tree as you do so. So in the first picture, you might look at a tree and see a branching in different directions, looking up the trunk. But if you take another perspective and you look more closely, then you see something quite different. Here you see a close-up of the bark of that tree. And if you look even more closely, you'll find a little surprise in here. On the right-hand side, you'll see a little face that looks like a monkey. So by changing our way of looking at things, we can go from seeing a tree right down to seeing the face of a little monkey. So that's quite a difference in perspective. So those are the two main ways of looking at this. Salyer, who is part of a major research group that's had a lot of influence on the way we think about learning and teaching in higher education, he and his colleagues in Gothenburg in Sweden did some research on university students, asking them what their conceptions of learning were. And he came up with 5 major conceptions of learning, which can be broken into these two rough categories we just talked about. So the first 3 of the conceptions that he noticed were related to seeing learning as a quantitative increase. So at the very lowest levels of that is literally that pile of rocks view, that one thing on top of another accumulation. A second framework for thinking about it is, a second way of looking at learning is memorizing. So in this view, we're seeing learning as a way of storing information that can be reproduced later. A third way of looking at it is to see it as acquiring facts, skills, and methods that can be retained and used later. So not just spitting it back out for a test, but actually being able to apply it. So I could give you an example from my own experience of viewing learning as a quantitative increase. When I was in school, as a young person, about 12 years old, I'd learned a lot of vocabulary. Week after week after week, we studied vocabulary, and I tended to think of that as just increasing, adding another word and another word and another word to my repertoire. And we had to memorize those for the tests, and each week we were quizzed, and we had to spell it properly, and we had to describe what the meaning of it was. And yes, I did realize that if I remembered this and retained this, that I could apply it. I could use this vocabulary in my writing, for example, and sometimes I did. But still, I was still seeing this as a quantitative increase. Another way of looking at things is a more qualitative change, which is not really what I did with my own vocabulary tests when I was 12 years old. But I did start to think about it more, start to experience learning as a qualitative change as an adult. For example, when I was studying geological terms, I lived in an area that was formed by glaciers, and I learned some terms that described glacial landscapes. Words like esker and kettle ponds and erratics, rather. And that those, by understanding those words and learning those words and appreciating them and connecting them to the landscapes around me, I could start to see the landscape differently. I could start to see the story of how that landscape was formed. So in this case, I was doing more than just memorizing those words. I was making sense of them. I was abstracting some meaning that connected to my own world, the world around me. So by relating these things and making those relationships, I was experiencing learning in a much more qualitative way. I was experiencing a change in my world and my ability to experience that world. The last of these qualitative changes is about interpreting and understanding reality in a different way. So again, if we go back to my example from geology, I had looked for years at a point of land jutting out into a lake. I'd simply seen it as a point of land with some houses on it and some trees. But by learning the term esker, I could then start to see that not just as a point of land in this lake today, but I could start to imagine the stream flowing under a glacier or through a glacier that created that landscape, that created what I was looking at. So I saw it as a stream bed, an ancient stream bed, rather than just a point of land. So I was able to interpret and understand reality in a different way. So these are some 5 different ways of thinking about learning. Some of those may match with what you've written down, and we can talk more about those later. And it may be that you have written down other things, which might be an extension of knowledge in this field.